There's something very poetic about the way that God works. He will create something and then he will hate it later on. And things end where they began. God created humanity and that went to shit. And so God killed everybody except for one man and his family. And then he gave them a second chance. He said, okay, I'll give you another chance. And that went to shit also. And people began to build the Tower of Babel, and God scattered them. And then people went to paganism. And so God went to the Jews, and he said, okay, I'm going to give you guys a temple. I'm going to give you guys a temple, and I'm going to give you guys a priesthood. And that went to shit. So God said, okay, I'm going to give it to Rome. I'm going to work with the Romans. I'm going to give you guys a church and a priesthood. And that also went to shit, as we all know. The church got completely contaminated with citizens of Sodom, predators, sexual predators, all sorts of weirdos and sickos. And so, yeah, that whole thing, it went to shit, right? So it's like God creates something and then he will hate it later on. He established a priesthood and a temple in Israel and then he destroyed it later on. It's like a bad marriage. It's like a bad marriage. And God has been married several times. He's had like, 3 or 4 divorces already. And that's it. So I'm wondering what's the church now? What's the church now? I see the Russians combating Sodom, and I see the Romans, the Roman church, completely embracing it, or to a great extent embracing Sodom. And with some priests here and there paying lip service to the eternal law against Sodom. But for the most part, you have all these priests in the Catholic Church embracing it and not really combating it. You don't really see the Roman Catholic Church combating it. In fact, you see the Pope defending it in numerous cases. And if you don't believe me, just look at Father James Martin and his defense of Sodom, his embrace of Sodom, and you don't see the Catholic Church stopping him. He just keeps on going. So, yeah, that's the way I look at it. God will create something, and then he will hate it later on. It's like a bad marriage. He created humanity, and he flushed humanity down the toilet with the flood. And he saved one man and his family. And then he established the priesthood of Noah, and people started building the Tower of Babel. So then he gave the temple to the Israelites, and they went to paganism. They got into weird tribalism and nationalism, and they had a war with the Romans, and the Romans destroyed them and destroyed the temple, destroyed the priesthood. In fact, there's a very fascinating story in Josephus's book on the Roman Jewish war. It's almost biblical. It's like something that you would read out of the New Testament. And it's where a bunch of priests go to Caesar and they're on their knees begging for their lives. And the Caesar says, now that your temple has been destroyed, of what use is your priesthood? And it's like St. Paul doing his last attempt at preaching to the Jews, and they reject him, and they start screaming and hollering and objecting and making a giant protest and all this. And St. Paul tells them, you can read this in the book of Acts, St. Paul tells them, I will go to the Gentiles and they will hear me. In other words, you're done. Your priesthood is done. And that's it. It's like that story in the New Testament where Jesus is harvesting grains of wheat, and these priests come along and they start saying, "Oh, what are you doing? You're picking wheat on the Sabbath, blah, blah, blah." And Jesus gives the wheat to his disciples. And what does he do before his crucifixion? He gives bread to his disciples and he tells them, "This is my body." In other words, giving the grain to the disciples, essentially saying to the Jewish leaders, of what use is your priesthood? It's on its last days. It's about to end. It's all going down. It's very fascinating. There's something very poetic and beautiful about all this. You know how you listen to a song and a good song will end the way that it begins. A good song will end the way that it begins. Not all the time, but many times this is how it happens. And it's like a poem. You begin a poem and then you end it in a similar way. And that's why in music you have, the verse and the chorus, and then there's a verse and a chorus, and then there's a bridge, right? There's usually some kind of instrumental that plays a guitar solo, and then you have a bridge, and the bridge will connect the bridge will connect the chorus to the end in some way, or the bridge will connect the first half of the song to the ending. That's why they call it a bridge. But it ends in the way that it begins, and that's how I see the way that God works in humanity. I see God ending things the way that he begins things, and he gives a people a temple, and then he goes back to the temple and he ends it just like a song ends. So he begins it with the temple. Here's the temple, here's the priesthood, and then he ends it. He starts something with the utmost of love, and then he ends things with the utmost of hatred. And yes, God does hate, because he sent his son, and his son was crucified, and his son was murdered. And he was so upset that he just said, "Destroy the temple, end it." He didn't say, "Well, I established my temple and it's all good. It's going to last forever, everlasting temple." No, he just ended it. That's it. He ended it. Because God's covenant is not limited to a people. It's not limited to a race. It doesn't have to be a particular race that holds the mantle forever. Once a people bring everything to shit, God will cut them off. He ends it with them. Just like he did with Israel. And he went to the Romans because the Romans destroyed the temple. So God says, "Okay, I'll give it to the Romans. Here's the church, here's the priesthood." And the Romans have brought everything to hell by embracing Sodom. And you can see it all over the Catholic world. So now we have the Russians, and the Russians are fighting Sodom, and the Romans aren't. So I have more favor with the Russians. I look at them with more favor because they're actually combating Sodom. And you have these Roman Catholics who come along and they're like, "Oh, the church is..." Yeah, but how come your church is embracing Sodom so much? That's not a small issue. It's not a small issue. The Romans are not combating anything. They're just, oh yeah, they'll go to a pro-life rally here and there, but we're at a point where abortion is not as big of a deal as it used to be. And Sodom is a much more polarizing issue. And here we have the Roman Catholics either doing nothing about it or embracing it. And you have a small minority that's actually combating it, but they're a minority. And then you have the Russian Orthodox Church, which combats it. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.